This is wildlife biologist Eric Orff with my New Hampshire Fish and Wildlife YouTube channel. Well, today I want to talk about New Hampshire's foxes. And I'm, as always, delving into one of my favorite books, Helen Silver's A History of New Hampshire Game and Fur Bears. An awesome, awesome book. And I don't know, I found this copy years ago. So, foxes. And the reason that I'm talking about foxes today is I wanted to, what set me up to this actually is today in the Concord Monitor, this is Monday, April 13th, it was an awesome article right here. What does the fox say? It's by Susie Spicole from the Hair Center over in Hancock. I used to give talks over there, but it's a conservation center over there, and Susie has some wonderful things to say about foxes. So let me. Foxes are an animal that that people seldom see, but they often mistake its sound for a fisher. And here in Susie's article, it says that researchers have documented over 20 different red fox vocalizations, from barks and whines to shrieks and screams. It's the screams that people for decades have mistake for a fishercat. So when I worked at Fish and Game, my 31 years there, for most of that career, for 30 of those years, I was the fur bear biologist, and I would be given calls that would come in about these screaming fishercats. Oh, it sounded like a woman being murdered, and it sounded awful, and it was in the dark of the night, and something terrible was happening out in the woods, and you know, I try to explain to them that's the sound of a fox. It's, you know, fisher are very quiet. They almost never make any noise at all. They don't scream, to my knowledge. Oh, but my neighbor said it was a fishercat. Well, it has not been a fishercat at all. It was the fox. The fox, it's the canids, coyotes and wolves and foxes, the canids that are vocal. And sure enough, they would be screaming. And after a while, I started mimicking the sound in my voice, and they would say, yeah, that's it. I said, well, that's a fox. That's not a fishercat. It's not a fisher at all. It's a fox. So Susie says here that, according to research, foxes have over 20 different vocalizations. What I didn't realize, and if you're out in the wintertime and you see where a canid or something has urinated on a stick or a tuft of grass, you can stoop over and give it a sniff, and a fox urine smells very, it's pungent, more like a skunk. Not it has a, but more of a, to me, more of a sweetness of it, if you can call urine sweet, but it does compared to a coyote. So even if there were no tracks, if there's some yellow snow, you can have a sniff and determine whether it was a fox or a coyote or something like that. So in here, she said they often urinate as up to 70 times an hour to mark their territory. So some pretty cool stuff from Susie Spicole here from the Harris Center over in Hancock. Thank you very much, Susie, and the Concord Monitor. But I said over the decades of my career, call after call that I get about the screaming fishercat, where in fact it was a fox, a red or a gray fox. But now, getting into Helen Silver's book, there's some discrepancy about whether they were actually a native here to North America or not, but apparently they were not very common in any case. And Seaton here in 1929 said they were entirely absent from the East Coast, but there are also records from the 16 and 1700s and fur records of them being in New Jersey and Delaware and Pennsylvania. So they were probably here, but just in very low numbers. And over the centuries, the numbers have varied quite a bit. And of course, foxes, being one of our fur bearers, are also taken by trappers. Let's see. There were certainly foxes in New England before the 1750s, although they were relatively minor importance, it says here. So both Wood and Morton were here more than 100 years before the English foxes were imported. So, yeah, some foxes were imported from England as well to mess things up even more. And of course, red foxes have been, I think, distributed practically all around the northern hemisphere, Europe and parts of Asia. So red foxes have been spread across the world by humans. It's the fur prices that have varied a great deal as well, and therefore the number taken by trappers over the years. They were despised for a long time. Foxes, when the fur wasn't of value, or at times it wasn't of value. It was actually for a number of years, for 50 or 60 years here, beginning in 1832, where there was a 25-cent bounty per head. The law was in effect for 3 years, then taken off, then it went back on in 1879. So foxes were bountied off and on over the 1800s. The season for a while, where there was a short season where you could trap or hunt them, and then they were left to their own devices. You could kill them year round. That happened well into the 60s, I believe, that you could hunt or trap foxes practically year round for a long time. I remember talking to a fellow from the old London Fishing Game Club, Carl Swalser, remembers trapping foxes in the late 30s and into the early 40s. The price diminished, so he said he held on to a bunch of foxes for a period of years. But looking at on page 280 of this book, in 1928, 5,419 red foxes were reported to have been taken by trappers. They averaged $17.23 per pelt. In that year alone, the value of the red foxes taken, this is in 1928, was over $93,000. 4,029 and 30 in the early 30s, and then 35 here we have 5,000 taken, right up to the early 40s, 46, 1945, 4,000 foxes taken. But by the late 40s, the value of the pelt considerably diminished. It went from, let's say here in 1943, it was $8.61 per pelt. By 1947, a pelt was only worth $1.88. By 1955, when you could trap or shoot them year round, a pelt was only valued at 47 cents. Only 37 were reported to have been taken in 1955. Imagine that. Well, when I began as a fur bearer biologist in the late 70s, well, there was a season on trapping and hunting foxes. And the most recent records I have here from the New Hampshire Fish and Game Harvest Report from 2018, it shows that in the 2017-18 season, 156 red foxes were taken. Over an 8-year period between 2010 and 2018, the average is only 214 red foxes per year. So the number taken by trappers has dramatically gone up and down over time. More recently, the numbers have been down, and there have been some concern for their numbers. I know the last year or two, the New Hampshire Trappers Association have been working with the state's trappers to collect carcasses, I think particularly from gray foxes, and they have been sent to the University of New Hampshire for analysis of diseases. And apparently there is a new type of distemper, I think I heard a few months ago, that they maybe have discovered that could very well be impacting our foxes, particularly the gray fox. So moving on to gray fox for just a second, gray foxes were never very common in New Hampshire as well. I know growing up there were more of, and being the fur bearer biologist, they were They were certainly animal of the southern counties, and it said here they were kind of gone for a long time, and then they in the early 1900s, 1911, they began to show up in the southwestern part of New Hampshire, Cheshire County, Hillsborough County. It said here, and they gradually grew in numbers and expanded in range. I remember during my tenure as the fur bearer biologist at New Hampshire Fish and Game that I could see from the annual trapper reports that yes, indeed, gray foxes did kind of push northward. They certainly are not very common in northern New Hampshire here. These records show that in the 2017-18 season, only 9 were taken in the northern region of New Hampshire, 14 in the White Mountains, 33 in central, 15 in the southwest, and 18 in the southeast. So between the central, southwest, and southeast, by far the majority of the 89 gray foxes taken that year were taken in central and southeast and southwest New Hampshire. So and the 8-year average for gray foxes is only 131, so far less than the number of red foxes. But taken in 2017-18, only 156 red foxes were taken. Compare that to back in the 20s when over 5,000 were being taken. And I remember when the fur prices were high again in the 70s, 78, 79, there were a couple of thousand foxes, red foxes, being taken then, but there never, to my recollection, has been any big number of gray foxes taken in any one year. No more than a couple of hundred in most years at most. So gray fox is still very uncommon. They are also vocal, just like the red foxes. So yes, foxes are around here, and they are fairly common. And it is the red fox, the gray fox that we hear screaming in the night. It is not a fisher or a fisher cat. It is a fox.